My name is Nick Merritt, a finance partner based in our Singapore office. And I'm delighted today to be joined by another partner based in Singapore, Andrew Digges. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Nick. Happy to be here with you.
So today we're going to talk about a slightly unusual topic in the context of Asia, which is the proposed European batteries regulations. And you may be wondering why two partners based in Singapore are talking about regulations that are going to be introduced next year within the European Union. Obviously, the EU has some very dynamic goals around net zero as a union, and there's a plethora of regulations that have been coming out by way of policy to address some of that, and that includes the new regulations on batteries from a European perspective that will impact the construction and manufacturing of those batteries. But Andrew, before we go into the detail of that, perhaps you can help us understand why that's relevant in the context of Asia.
Yes, sure, Nick. So the batteries that are used in electric vehicles in Europe, but also everywhere else in the world, need to be very efficient from a weight to power output perspective. And the best current technology for batteries that suit EVs is batteries that have a high nickel content in their cathodes. So the world's supplies of nickel historically have come from North America and Russia and Australia, different parts of the world. And more recently, there's been a lot of production of resources in Indonesia and the Philippines as well, and other places. A very large portion historically of the nickel that's been produced in Indonesia and the Philippines was shipped to China, where it was being processed and turned into batteries. And a very large portion of the EV battery market is currently coming out of China, where 60% of the batteries are being produced. But in 2014, new regulations came out in Indonesia in particular, which required the nickel miners to also refine and process their nickel within the country. And since then, there's been huge investment in the refining sector in Indonesia. What's become clear now, based on some discussions I've had with some battery metals experts, is that most of the growth, if not all of the growth in the next decade of the supply of refined nickel for EV batteries is actually going to come from Indonesia, as it has some key economic advantages and also abundant resources. So Asia is a very big part of the global battery mineral supply story. I think perhaps if you go into a bit more detail about what's proposed in the restrictions in the EU, it'll become a bit clearer why they are going to have an impact right up the supply chain, including to the sources of those minerals.
Yeah, sure. So I mentioned that the proposed batteries regulation that the EU is looking to introduce into law next year is part of a wider strategy of decarbonising the economy. And the regulations are going to impose what they're calling a battery passport. So for batteries, including EV batteries, to enter the European Union in the future, they will need to have this online registry entry called a passport. And that will set out a couple of key criteria. One of the fundamental issues that the EU is trying to address is the carbon footprint of batteries entering the EU. Initially, they will require the footprint under a very specific methodology to be declared. They will then assess that information, and then going forward from mid-2027, they will impose a maximum life cycle carbon footprint on batteries that intend to be used within the EU. Two other key issues that relate to the regulations. One is that they are imposing an obligation on the producer of the battery to recover and recycle the battery at the end of its useful life. This is the circular economy in action, where those valuable materials are recovered and recycled. And the third element is that content in the batteries from 2030 must have minimum levels of recycled cobalt, lead, lithium or nickel, depending on the underlying technology, and also the obligations on the materials to be recovered from the batteries are also being imposed. And by 2035, as much as 95% of metals in those batteries will need to be recovered. So there's a number of significant issues that impact the battery supply chain from an organizational, a manufacturing, and potentially a recovery and recycling perspective. So What does that look like from your lens, Andrew, in the context of the supply chain industry in Indonesia?
Yeah, sure, Nick. Well, so in Indonesia, I think the biggest direct impact from these EU regulations is going to be that carbon footprint element. And at the moment, the nickel mining and refining sector in Indonesia has a number of ESG issues compared to other parts of the world, but one of them is definitely that it is a very carbon intensive industry. And that includes from the use of diesel trucks in mines and transportation, particularly because coal-fired power is usually the source of energy used for the refining and smelting process, and it's a very electricity-intensive process. And there's also actually coking coal used as a reductant in the smelting process of lateritic ores, which are the most common ores found in Indonesia. So it's a very carbon-intensive industry, and where their end user markets are requiring the carbon footprint all the way back to source to be reduced or below certain maximum amounts, they're going to have to react to that. And it's a very big challenge for Indonesia. Decarbonizing this industry is difficult because the resources, which are predominantly in Sulawesi and Halmahera, are a long way from abundant renewable energy resources. There's potential for solar and wind power to be brought in as part of a solution, and we're aware of some solar developers that are engaging now with the industry to try and provide some alternative energy. But variable renewable energy is not going to be the full solution. And that's because these smelters really do require very steady state, high levels of electricity on a 24/7 basis. The smelters, the cores run at very high temperatures and have to be maintained and cannot be allowed to cool. So solar and wind will only work in a hybrid solution. A better longer term solution would be large sources of baseload renewable energy, such as hydroelectric power and geothermal electricity. Now, these do exist in Indonesia, but again, they're not currently near the resources, except for a couple of exceptions. And we've been in discussions with some key stakeholders in the industry, and we know that they are putting a lot of effort into trying to resolve this issue and considering various options. One of the options they're considering is trying to move in a coordinated way a very large portion of the nickel processing capacity in Indonesia to a hub that is closer to where the renewable energy sources, the baseload hydroelectric renewable energy sources exist. So there's a lot going on, and a lot of that is going to come as a direct impact of the EU regulations and potential regulations similar to those that might come in other EV markets in the future. And what's certain is that there's going to be substantial change in the sector in Indonesia as a result of this.
So it's clear that the European regulations are designed to have an impact globally. So thanks so much for joining us this week, Andrew.
That's my pleasure, Nick.